Committee will come to order. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today to discuss the 2020 census and the U.S. Census Bureau's ongoing work on that effort. The 2020 census is a national roadmap for the next 10 years. This official count of our population directly impacts communities in Michigan as well as all across the United States. It determines everything from representation in Congress to the amount of federal funds each state receives for critical health care programs, infrastructure projects, schools, and much more. Ensuring an accurate 2020 census was especially challenging during the coronavirus pandemic, as well as interference from the Trump administration. The pandemic forced the Bureau to delay its in-person data collection by 3 months and delay data delivery by at least 4 months to ensure accuracy. The Bureau requested an extension of its statutory data delivery deadlines to provide additional certainty, and I fought for this legislation, but the leadership, unfortunately, of the previous Senate majority opposed it. Nevertheless, the Bureau's nonpartisan career staff adapted, moved ahead with their delayed operations, and made good progress counting people. But the previous administration threw the census into question when the Commerce Department demanded the Bureau deliver data to the President by December. This move would have cut short data processing by 2.5 months and would have resulted in harmful consequences and inaccurate census results for communities in Michigan and across the nation. And of course, there was a climate of uncertainty and fear created earlier by President Trump's untested citizenship question and followed by his executive orders on citizenship data. Fortunately, these misguided efforts to rush the census for political gain fell short. It is critical that lawmakers now work on a bipartisan basis, recognize the need for accurate census data, and respect the Census Bureau's career experts who are committed to data accuracy, as they like to say, quote, counting every person once, only once, and in the right place, end of quote. There is no question that as the Census Bureau continues to process the data they have collected and conduct robust data quality checks, their hardworking and dedicated employees not only deserve our gratitude, but the resources and time to get it right. To put this into perspective, in my home state of Michigan, at least $1,800 in federal funding per person relies on an accurate census count. This provides for critical programs that help hardworking Americans pay their bills, receive health care, send their children to school, and much more. Michigan is also home to more than 800,000 hard-to-count residents. These folks, who include rural residents, students, children, low-income households, and the homeless, often receive much-needed federal support, and it is absolutely essential that they are included in an accurate census. An accurate census not only helps folks across our nation, but also our nation's businesses, who use the data to determine where to create jobs by building facilities, offices, and stores. They also use the data to market their services and products so they can grow their business and the American economy. The 2020 census will be a roadmap for every state and community for the next 10 years. We must ensure that every American is counted regardless of economic or social circumstances. The Bureau faced incredible challenges to this mission in 2020, and now we must work together to finish the 2020 census and ensure that it is a success. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize our federal data experts who are working diligently to finish the census while ensuring that it is accurate. I look forward to discussing their work here at today's hearing. With that, I now turn it over to Senator Langford for an opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for being here. For Chair Peters and Ranking Member Portman, thanks for holding this hearing. This is exceptionally important. It's one of the issues that we don't just deal with 5 minutes every 10 years, as a lot of households do, but we deal with it consistently, and we continue to be able to work through this process. As the ranking member of the newly formed Government Operations and Border Management Subcommittee, I'm also working with Chair Sinema to monitor the progress the Census Bureau makes over the next couple of months, and there's a lot to still be done. Despite the exceptional challenges faced by the Census Bureau in the last year, I'm pleased to see that 99.9% of the country was enumerated. It's a remarkable achievement. Even more remarkable is the self-response rate increased in 2020 compared to 2010. This is crucial because self-responses provide the most accurate and quality data. But we now face a massive dilemma. The first set of data released by the Bureau, the apportionment count, which is a tally of all individuals in the country, has not been delivered, and it was due on December 31. This has a detrimental snowball effect on the delivery of the second round of data, the redistricting data that states use to draw their districts. That data was due by March the 31st. We were told 1 month ago that this data won't be delivered until September the 30th, a 5-month delay. So the issue. September the 30th is past the deadline in some states for drawing their districts. In my state of Oklahoma, the legislative session will be over in September, as it will for most legislatures in the country. In addition, my state has a constitutionally mandated deadline to redraw our districts by 90 days after the start of the legislative session, which was February the 1st. Clearly, our state will not be able to make our constitutional responsibility to be able to redraw districts, which will create an enormous litigation nightmare within our state for redrawing districts, what has been a very consistent system for us for a very long time. This is obviously the latest the data has ever come out, and it will create untold issues because we don't know all the secondary effects. This 5-month delay will limit public engagement in redistricting efforts and will change that normal rhythm. Oklahoma, my state, is just one example of what's going to happen across the country. We do understand there were unique challenges in 2020. All of us know that. But we have to be able to figure out now what. What are the deadlines? Where did we go sideways on those deadlines? How do we manage costs? And what does this look like for maintaining basic quality control? Counting every single person in this country is obviously costly. But this is something constitutionally we're going to do every single time. Estimated cost for 2020 census was $15.6 billion. We don't know if we've made those deadlines yet for that certain amount, and we'll be interested to be able to see what is the final cost. The average cost for counting has gone up every single 10 years for quite a while. Former Census Director Robert Groves told Congress that the rising cost of the census is unsustainable and untenable. And I would agree. Census expenditures per household were 37% higher in 2010 than they were in 2000. They were 76% higher in 2000 than in 1990. Since 1970, the average cost to count each house has moved from $16 a household to $94 a household in 2010, and we don't know what the cost will be yet for 2020. High cost, challenging logistics creates opportunities for innovation. We get that. So part of the dialogue I'd like to have today is not only what went sideways in the past year, but also where are we going for the 2030 census? There is an entity within the federal government that actually touches almost every household in America every single year, not just every year. That would be the IRS. The IRS touches almost every household every single year. And though they had significant struggles in 2020 as well, anyone who's tried to pick up the phone and call an IRS helpline could tell you that for the last several months because they can't get a live person. There is a responsibility to be able to maintain that data. And I have asked the question for years, can we every 10 years merge some of the operations within IRS and Census to be able to make sure that Americans can file one form in April of that year that does both their census and their IRS? That's an issue I have brought up. I will continue to bring up. When we're passing $16 billion just to be able to do the census count, we should be looking for efficiencies, and we should be looking for ways to be able to make sure that we are getting it on time. So I want us to be able to walk through that process, and we'll start that again today on that. I really do thank the panel for your work. This is not a simple task, counting the homeless, making sure that people that are moving are not being double counted, counting individuals across the country is a very difficult challenge. So I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, but we are interested in some questions and some answers today. So I look forward to that. Chair, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Senator Langford. It is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of you will stand and raise your right hand, please. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Our first witness today is Dr. Ron Jarmon, Acting Director of the United States Census Bureau. Dr. Jarmon is also currently the Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of the Census Bureau and has been since January of 2019. He stepped up as Acting Director in January of 2021 after the retirement of Director Stephen Dillingham. Dr. Jarmon has also served as Acting Director from July 2017 to January 2019. He began his career at the Census Bureau in 1992 and has also played leading roles in Bureau's economic programs and research and methodology. Welcome, Dr. Jarmon. You are now recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today to talk about the successes and challenges of the 2020 census, how the pandemic spurred innovation in our other work, and what lies ahead. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge my fellow witness, Chris Mim, who is testifying at his last Census Bureau-related hearing before his retirement. His oversight has been instrumental in guiding us to a successful 2020 census, and everyone at the Census Bureau sends their congratulations to you, Chris. 2020 was a challenging year for everyone, but we were fortunate to experience some successes at the Census Bureau. The 2020 census offered online response without any downtime or hacks. We ran the nation's largest advertising campaign, making new commercials to reflect the new realities. We found new ways to support partners, including our congressional ones, who helped us encourage their constituents to respond. Your support was invaluable, and I thank you for your oversight and your recognition of our work's value. Throughout all of this, we kept our regular survey work going and developed new statistics to track the impact of the pandemic on households and businesses. While we mourned the loss of family members, friends, and colleagues, juggled childcare and work, and watched the world change in numerous ways. I have never been prouder to work alongside the talented public servants at the Census Bureau, and I'm privileged to showcase some of our work today. Stay-at-home orders implemented due to the pandemic started just after the 2020 census began. In response, we suspended all in-person work and hiring. Fortunately, innovations we introduced allowed the public to continue to respond to the 2020 census and helped us to onboard and train staff virtually. We made daily, data-driven decisions on when and where to resume or start operations safely. We adapted by adding new features to our original plans, including calling households that hadn't responded, sending emails to encourage response, and advertising in additional languages to reach even more people. Stakeholders and partners around the country dedicated themselves to finding new ways to educate and motivate the public to respond in fresh ways. Once we finished collecting the data, we began processing it. During this complex work that takes time and expertise, we discovered some anomalies, as we do every decade. To be clear, anomalies are not errors, but they can turn into errors if we do not resolve them. Finding and fixing anomalies shows that our quality checks are working. We are on track to produce the apportionment counts by April 30th, and we expect to deliver redistricting data no later than September 30th as a single national delivery to ensure that we can provide the data that meet the quality that states expect. We also will release an interim file in August that contains the same data as the September release. It just will not be as user-friendly as the September data, but we are continued to do everything possible to get this critical information to the states as quickly as we can. We know that the pandemic-induced changes we made that we had to make raised questions about data quality, and we want to make sure that everyone is confident with the data we release. So, for the first time, we plan to release data quality metrics to provide the public even more transparency into our work. We are also enlisting 3 outside expert groups, the JSONs, the American Statistical Association, and the National Academy of Sciences Committee on National Statistics, to examine our quality metrics and review our 2020 census processes, procedures, and decisions. We know that the information we produce matters to people every day, so we know that we must take the time to get it right. Getting it right for the decennial census meant delaying our original schedule so we could conduct it safely and taking the time needed to process the data so that we can produce high-quality statistics. Getting it right also means making sure we protect the data so that everyone feels safe responding and so that everyone is reflected in the statistics we produce. We are modernizing the method we use to protect people's information when we release the 2020 census results. Our challenge is to balance the accuracy and utility of the data we release with the risks to respondent privacy. The most accurate and useful data would be if we published every household's response with no protections. Clearly, that is unacceptable and against the law. So over the decades, the Census Bureau has continuously improved privacy protection using methods like aggregation, suppression, and swapping sensitive records. Ubiquitous data and technological advances have created more sophisticated tools that dramatically increase the risks to privacy and confidentiality in detailed data sets like those produced from the 2020 census. And the tools we've used before are no longer sufficient. The method we're using, differential privacy, allows us to use specialized formulas to balance privacy and accuracy so that our information continues to be useful while also protecting individual information as required by law. We welcome conversations about where the ideal balance point exists. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmon. Our second witness is Mr. Christopher Mim. Mr. Mim is the Managing Director of the Strategic Issues Team at the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. His team led GAO's work on 2020 census operations, including preparedness, field work, data quality risk, and more. He also leads GAO's work on government-wide strategy, performance, and resource issues, including the high-risk list. He joined GAO in September of 1983, and since then has worked to support the Congress on a range of issues. Mr. Mim, I understand you'll be retiring at the end of March after 37 years of federal service. Yes. And I certainly want to thank you for your many years of dedication to the American people. Thank you. Your work has been essential for helping Congress analyze and approve government programs. Congratulations, Mr. Mim, and thank you for being here today, and please proceed with your 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Peters, and thank you very much for your very gracious words. I appreciate that quite a bit. Mr. Chairman and Senator Lankford, and members of the committee, my colleague Nick Marinos and I are pleased to be here to discuss the 2020 census. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, in your opening comments, census data are used by government at all levels, the private sector, researchers, citizens, to provide a national 10-year roadmap for making decisions. So it's absolutely vital that we get it right, and as you mentioned, get the right count in the right place and only once. In being here today, Nick and I have the great privilege of presenting the work of our GAO colleagues who have been supporting congressional oversight of the census for many years. As the committee is well aware, even in the best of circumstances, completing the census is an enormous and complex undertaking. Yet, Mr. Chairman, as you and Senator Lankford noted, 2020 was by far from the best of circumstances, with the COVID-19 pandemic making the census all the more challenging. Just over 1 year ago, as the Bureau had begun to mail out invitations to participate in the census, it was forced to suspend field operations because of COVID-19. The Census Bureau subsequently delayed field operations multiple times and made a series of late changes to the design of the census. Our prepared statement details those changes the Bureau made in response to the pandemic and related executive branch decisions. Overall, the changes affected the way the Bureau did its work, and as well as the time it took to do the work. The changes also introduced risks of quality to the congressional apportionment and redistricting data. As you know, and as you've both mentioned, the Bureau's current plan is to deliver apportionment count data by April 30 and final redistricting data by September 30. As it prepares this data, I would underscore 2 points from our work. First, as Director Jarmon noted, the Bureau is responding to recommendations by the American Statistical Association and the Department of Commerce's Census Scientific Advisory Committee. We view these as very positive developments. These recommendations called for the Bureau to document what it knows in near real time about the quality of the population counts that it provides to the President and to the Congress. We also reported in December on census quality indicators that the Bureau should consider, provided when it releases apportionment counts. These quality indicators were consistent with the work of the ASA and the Advisory Committee. We firmly believe and agree with the Census Bureau that disclosing what is known and not yet known about census data in near real time will increase transparency and public confidence in the census. Second, in December, we also identified concerns about how late changes to the census design could affect data quality. These concerns range from how the altered timeframes affected population counts during field data collection to what effects, if any, the compressed and streamlined processing of census data have on the Bureau's ability to detect and fully address processing or other areas. We recommended in December, and a report issued just yesterday, that the Bureau ensure that its 2020 assessments first address how the late changes to the census design could affect data quality, and second, support planning for the 2030 census. The Department of Commerce and the Census Bureau agreed with both of those recommendations and described ongoing and planned activities to implement them. Notably, the Bureau's activities included planning to release the information, as I mentioned, and findings on data qualities as it becomes available. One final point. As you know from the hearing that the Comptroller General held before this committee earlier this month, the decennial census remains on our high-risk list. Normally, it would come off in the year after the census is completed. However, he asked us to keep it on this time for two reasons. Not just because we're not done with the 2020 census, but for precisely, Senator Lankford, as you were mentioning, we need to be thinking early and hard about what the 2030 census is going to be looking at. The Census Bureau made a number of important innovations and changes as it was preparing and planning for the 2020 census. We need to make sure that that energy and momentum and that force of innovation carries through into 2030 as well. Let me end there, and once again, I want to thank the committee and you, Mr. Chairman, for your very kind words, for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Our final witness today is Mr. Nick Marinos, Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at GAO. His team has led GAO's work to analyze the IT and cybersecurity components of the 2020 census, a crucial part of the operation, particularly as the census was the first, or this last census was the first to have online response option. His team also performs audits across all major federal agencies in the areas of cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, privacy, and data protection. Mr. Marinos joined GAO in 2002. Welcome, Mr. Marinos. You may proceed with your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Lankford, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting GAO to discuss the status of the 2020 census. So today I'd like to provide you with an update on IT systems, cybersecurity, and the Bureau's efforts for protecting the data it collected from census respondents. Starting with IT systems, as the chairman noted, the Internet Self-Response System operated as intended during the 2020 census, and most people who self-responded did so online. And the Bureau reported that it did not experience any system downtime during the census. In addition, the Bureau's use of smartphones to conduct non-response follow-up work played a critical role in its ability to adapt to the pandemic and achieve a higher than expected rate of worker productivity.
You'll be done.
Nonetheless, the Bureau still has important system implementation work to do. Currently, the Bureau is processing census responses, which is a critical activity intended to help ensure that the data are complete and formatted correctly. In addition, system testing is still ongoing for important census operations. Among these is the Bureau's post-enumeration survey, which is intended to assess the quality of the 2020 census. Going forward, a continued focus on meeting testing milestones and scheduled deployments will be important for ensuring that the Bureau's systems operate as intended. With respect to cybersecurity, as Dr. Jarmon pointed out, the Bureau has reported no major cyber incidents that have impacted decennial operations. Throughout the past several years, the Bureau coordinated with officials at DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, leveraging their expertise to conduct cybersecurity assessments and provide consultative support. The Bureau also implemented a trust and safety team to quickly respond to disinformation and misinformation events in order to protect the reputation of the Bureau and the integrity of the 2020 census. In light of recent high-profile cyber attacks impacting both public and private sectors, however, it's vital for the Bureau to continue its vigilance and to work with CISA to ensure that its remaining operations are adequately protected. Turning to the topic of data protection. Now that the data collection has ended for the 2020 census, the Bureau's focus is shifting to the development and release of statistical products. When producing and distributing these products, it's important for the Bureau to maintain the confidentiality of individual respondent information as required by law. To do this, the Bureau plans to apply a data protection technique known as differential privacy. In December, we noted that the operational delays that Chris mentioned created uncertainty in the plans and schedules for differential privacy. Last month, the Bureau updated and finalized its schedule for implementing differential privacy on the redistricting data. We discussed these plans in more detail in our written statement, but the bottom line is that the next few months will be critical to implementing data protection. We are actively monitoring the Bureau's efforts in this area, and we will keep you updated. In summary, key technology innovations like the Internet Self-Response System and the use of smartphones in the field provided the Bureau with the ability to better perform its mission during the pandemic, but there's more work to be done. Ultimately, the success of the decennial census depends on the Bureau's ability to adequately protect the data it collected from millions of Americans. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement.
Well, thank you. Dr. Jarmon, as you and your counterparts have testified, the 2020 census certainly faced unprecedented challenges, including delaying in-person counting by about 3 months, adapting your operations to the pandemic, facing interference as a result of directives from the previous administration that led to large-scale schedule changes. And we know any kind of change in long-established plans creates more risk and more error. So my question to you is, given all of the challenges and changes, how did the Bureau decide in 2021 that it needed more time for processing the data, and why do Bureau experts believe this total amount of time was necessary?
Well, thank you, Chair. So I think first and foremost, our objective is to release complete and accurate information. And so that drives many of our operational decisions last year and drives our decisions right now about how we're processing the data. So when we looked at where we were in the schedule and what still needed to be done, I think that's what drives the dates that we've announced. So the apportionment data will come out at the end of April. Maybe we might beat that by a little bit, and then, the final redistricting data by the end of September. But that includes a bunch of software updates that make the data, easy to access and utilize. And so that's why we did make the decision to produce similar data that we produced in 2010 and make that available in August, because obviously, we're trying to get the data to the states as quickly as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're eagerly awaiting the information, as you know.
Let us know that.
Mr. Mim, GAO studied the risk of a compressed data processing schedule last year. What are those risks? What can happen if the Bureau does not have enough time to run full quality checks on the data? Paint that picture for me.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the challenge that the Bureau faces is that it's a once-a-decade operation with no opportunity for a do-over and very little opportunity for changes on the fly. And in fact, one of the strengths of the census, when it's done right, is that it will be done consistently across the country in a uniform manner. What late design changes do is at first it runs the risk, or it introduces untested approaches. And second, it then requires that those untested approaches be cascaded down and uniformly implemented across the country. That's always a very difficult operation to do. Maintaining for the Census Bureau just control in a normal circumstance can be difficult to do. It gets exceedingly difficult when you're implementing changes on top of that. As you were mentioning, coming into the field, going out of the field, going back into the field, and can be very, very difficult.
Some of the most spotty data, which the Bureau still has to work through, as you know, is for the most vulnerable constituents, nursing home residents, homeless people, people impacted by natural disasters. How can the Census Bureau be particularly vigilant through the end of the census to make sure that vulnerable and hard-to-count individuals, which I mentioned in my opening comments, are roughly 800,000 people in Michigan, how are these groups going to be properly accounted for during this difficult time?
counting these individuals, and it's the hard to enumerate population, is among the most difficult parts of the census, as you were saying. The Bureau did run into challenges in getting people and getting counts out of what they refer to as group quarters, which would be skilled nursing facilities, homelessness shelters, or shelters that, or for persons experiencing homelessness, prisons. And in fact, one of the innovations, and I think this is a positive development, is that when they had over 24,000 of these group quarters that were reporting zero data, they went back out in December to try and confirm that and try and get better data from this. Because as you mentioned, this is a very vulnerable population. It's hard to count in the best of circumstances. And when you had a number of these group quarters, especially those providing services that may have closed down or people that weren't familiar with the technology used to report back to the Census Bureau, that's what led them to have to go back out and reach out to these in late December.
Mr. Marinos, the 2020 census has a massive IT and cybersecurity operation. 52 different systems, in fact, are used to collect and protect the data. The Bureau has worked very closely, I know, with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, commonly known as CISA, at DHS to strengthen its cybersecurity. But could you describe to the committee how this relationship was unprecedented in many respects? And as we look across the kind of the government cybersecurity ecosystem, and what can we learn from this collaboration that will be helpful going forward?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that is, I think, a good way to put it. It is certainly unprecedented, and it's also lengthy in its history. The Bureau and CISA began coordinating several years ago. So in the lead up to key 2020 operations, CISA had already been on site to perform threat assessments and vulnerability assessments for the Bureau and provided recommendations, feedback to the Bureau so that they could take action to improve the protections of their systems. In addition to that, as key operations were starting up, CISA shifted to more active relationship with the Bureau, actually having dedicated staff within CISA available to provide assistance when needed to the Bureau as it was starting up things like the Internet Self-Response last March. And so I think what we've seen here is a really good model for how CISA could be leveraged for other key operations within the federal government, not only during key operations, but in the lead up. Providing that feedback is important, and most importantly, what we've seen the Bureau do over the last couple of years, in response also to a recommendation we made, was take to heart that feedback that it got from CISA. So it's not only about CISA providing the recommendations, but seeing the agencies take it and improve their systems, which is what we did see the Bureau do. Yeah,
that's good to hear. Very good to hear. Final question, Dr. Jarmon. Is it correct that there have been no data breaches or significant cybersecurity incidents related to the 2020 census operations thus far?
That is correct. I mean, we did work hard, as Mr. Marinos said, to work with all of the expert groups from CISA, folks at the Department of Commerce, but also with private sector companies to make sure that we, sort of made sure that we had all of the bases covered to make sure that either cyber threats or misinformation, disinformation threats would pose a threat to the census.
Well, it's good to hear. Thank you, Dr. Jarmon. Chair now recognizes Senator Langford for your questions.
Chairman, thank you very much. Gentlemen, thanks again for being here. Let me cut right to 2030, and then I want to be able to work back to 2020 and be able to do some review from there. What would inhibit the IRS and Census from sharing some of their operations in 2030 to increase the efficiency? And I would tell you, I started talking about this at about 2013, and the answer from that administration was, well, the IRS has a bad reputation, Census has a great reputation, and we don't want to commingle it. That was their public answer. So please don't give me that answer. So what would inhibit us technically to be able to do that? My understanding is IRS and Census already share some information. Why can't we actually share the harvesting of data from Americans all over the country in that shared return?
So I'll start with that. So I think it's important to note that we've successfully, used administrative records to enumerate, I think, about 6 million households in the 2020 census. Much of that information is sourced from the IRS, but other organizations as well. I'm not sure that the dual collection would make the most sense, but we already have a close working relationship with the IRS and get records from them that we can use for this purpose. We have a project ongoing that just started this fiscal year that will seek to integrate our sort of geospatial information with information on where people live using these administrative records that I think will lay the groundwork for just the type of more complete use of administrative records to try to reduce costs.
So why wouldn't dual collection work? People are turning in online or in paper form, most of them online at this point with the IRS, to be able to add an additional 10 questions.
Well, I think I'd want to test that and see how that worked.
You have 9.5 years to test it at this point. Well, I'm not being facetious,
Right.
but in some ways pushing to say that this is one of those obvious issues when I raise and say we turn in every 10 years in April to the census, but we turn in every single year to the IRS in April. Why couldn't 10 questions be added to what we do with the IRS every 10 years? And so when they actually do that forms or when they're turning it in, they're also answering their census and checking that off.
So first of all, not everybody fills out a census.
That's correct.
Fills out a
Not everyone fills out their census information. We have to chase those as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, but the IRS doesn't knock on your door, though. At least not yet. So this would be something I think we would have to work with the IRS. I'm not sure where they sit on this. I think the fact that Census and IRS can work more closely, and other administrative agencies, we get information from other federal agencies, from states. All this information could be useful.
Right.
And so I think trying to find a way to make the best use of that information to reduce costs and increase the quality of our data is what we're trying to do.
I have to say, most of the time when I get in this conversation, it's because they're in their silo and you're in yours. And it's, again, not trying to be demeaning in that. It's just we haven't done it before. They have their stuff and their timelines. We have our stuff and our timelines. But it's $16 billion. We've got to find a way to be able to find some efficiency between the two. And if there's a way to be able to say, let's work with a system that already works every single year, gathering well over 100 million households, and that can get us started that quickly. It's not that Americans are in the habit of self-filling out information from census. They only do it every 10 years, and every 10 years it's a little bit different than it was in the past, and no telling how we'll do that in 2030, depending on the technology. It's an area I think we need to explore and not just say, how can we gather some of the administrative data? How can we actually gather the data at the beginning of it and to see if we can merge some of those operations and save the taxpayer significant dollars? Let me ask you about some of the deadlines early on this year. When is the first time that states were officially notified that the deadline would not be achieved?
So I'm not sure. I know, if we have a staff that works with the states all the time, and I think we knew that, making the deadlines was going to be difficult. But I think the first official notification was earlier in February. So
okay, that's the challenge we have. For instance, in my state in Oklahoma, we have to do all of our redistricting within 90 days of when our session begins, February the 1st. So we were already in the process of doing redistricting meetings, doing all of those things, and then suddenly we get notification, not that we're going to be a little late, that we're going to be 5 months late. Now that really throws everything out. So when did you know at first you were going to be 5 months late?
it was right about that time. I mean, I think before, last fall, coming up on the apportionment deadline, the focus was really on trying to meet the statutory deadline for apportionment, and there was all hands on deck to do that. So some of the work that we would have been doing then on redistricting was in order to crash the schedule for apportionment, we set that aside, and so it wasn't until after the start of the year that we started, seeing what the real ramifications of that was.
So with the apportionment deadline, as I'm seeing, you're about 3 months behind on getting that collected from where your original targets are. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah.
So even in January,
almost 4 months. But
so even in January, you thought you could still make that up. It wasn't until late January, early February before you knew you're actually be 5 months late.
Before we knew with some certainty, I think it's fair to say that we knew that we weren't going to make the March date. But
so that's what I'm trying to get at. When do you think? When is your best guess of when you knew we're not going to make March? We could not just be late; we could be significantly late.
So I think what we learned from last fall was to not be giving dates that we couldn't stand by. So we wanted to wait till we had a better sense of that, and that was early February.
Okay. Obviously, the challenge that we have with that is every state had already started the process of getting things together, and had already started their redistricting meetings and their public meetings and all those things, and that'll all have to be redone all over again, as well as all the litigation that's going to follow from that as well. You had mentioned before about if you don't do the software updates and the things and to perfect the way that you're releasing it, if you release the redistricting data the same way you did in 2010, you do for the 2020 time period, you could shave some time off of that September 30th date. How much time do you think that could be?
So mid to late August.
Okay.
So about a month, or maybe a little bit more.
That would be helpful to be able to get.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. We're in the middle of votes, so you'll be seeing committee members kind of running in and out. In fact, I will be doing that. I'm going to be running out to vote. We'll turn over to Ranking Member Portman for his questions, and he will preside over the hearing until I return. Ranking Member Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know that Senator Langford has already asked you guys some pertinent questions because he has a strong interest in this, given the situation in his state and also his expertise on this issue. Ohio is one of those states that's negatively impacted, as you know. We have constitutional requirements that may lead us to not be able to use your data, which is just unheard of. So I guess, Dr. Jarmon, my first question would be, I know that due to COVID-19, you announced this 6-month delay. The apportionment data only needed a 4-month delay. My question for you, I guess, would be, by law, redistricting data should be available 3 months after the apportionment data, but this is 5 months later. Why that delay?
So I think part of that, I was just explaining to Senator Langford, was while we were making an effort to make the statutory deadline for the apportionment data, which is the December 31st, we crashed the schedule, put all hands on deck to accomplish that, and that meant that some of the work that we would have started for the apportionment, for the redistricting data, was set aside until later, and so I think that's added some time. I think the other thing is, we're trying to make sure that we have this all right and make sure that the timeline that we've specified is one that we can meet. So I hope we can beat the timeline a little bit, but it's definitely, as you saw last fall when we had said, timing on apportionment data was going to be this or going to be that. We want to give the public and the states a little more certainty about when we can actually deliver.
Yeah, well, certainty is nice, but having the data available is even nicer.
Yeah.
We have a September 1st deadline, as you know. Let me ask you this. Why can't you provide states like Ohio that have these constitutional deadlines data on a rolling basis? In other words, provide us our data. You don't need to provide it to every state because some states have more flexibility than we do.
No, we understand that, and the original plan was to put it out on a rolling basis. But I think as we've gone back and tried to find the fastest way that we can deliver the data to the states, it is to produce it all at once. The reviews are done, sort of across all of the states. I think if we were to prioritize, a small number of states, that would actually increase the amount of time it would take us to get the data out. So we're trying to optimize and get it out as quickly as possible.
Well, I hope you understand the negative consequences here, because we're in the middle of a redistricting change in Ohio, not just because of the 10-year data, but also because we're looking at redistricting reform. And this is really putting us back and causing tremendous problems. GAO has indicated that September 17 is your target release date with a 2-week security buffer. Will you commit to notifying this committee as soon as you become aware of any issue that could delay the data past September 17th?
Absolutely.
That's at a minimum what we really need to do. I'm told that you don't want more money to be able to speed this up because you think that won't help. How could that be? Wouldn't more resources be able to give you the ability to put more people against this and to get this done more quickly?
So that's a great question, Senator. And so I think what you need to remember is that right now we're in a process where data are processed and then they're reviewed, and that review is done by experienced expert staff. and trying to increase the number of people looking at the data would require those expert staff to then train new folks, and I think that would just add time to this. This is one of the things, when we talk about looking ahead to 2030, if there is something that happens in data collection that puts us behind for data processing, the data processing was not a focus of a lot of the efforts for the 2020 census. And so, it was all done with thinking there was 5 months to get this all done, or at least to get the apportionment data out. So I think thinking about what the back end looks like for 2030 could help us in this, but obviously for 2020 with the pandemic, we didn't have that luxury. And so it's a situation where the processing of these data is done by a relatively small, when I'm small, 100 or so expert staff that process and review these data, and increasing that staff right now would actually slow us down.
That seems nonsensical to me, to be frank with you, that you can't find some way to bolster your expertise and to between now and August, which gives you, a few months to do it.
We've already brought in some internal staff that, have similar types of skills, but if we were to bring in new people from outside, I'd have to take people who are currently working on this and have them teach these new people, what to do.
Well, give me a commitment today that you will put your thinking cap on and see if there's any creative way that you could at least get us this data a couple weeks earlier.
Yeah,
literally, we're going to have no time in Ohio to look at the raw data, much less the final data. And if we had another 2 weeks, it would make a huge difference.
We're already looking for every way that we can speed this up, so we'll continue to do so.
Okay. I see Senator Romney is here, and I want to go to him next, but ask you a question that actually relates to some of his local communities. This most recent data set, I'm told that some small towns in Utah saw a 20 to 30% population change as a result of differential privacy. Do you expect similar results for small towns in the final data?
I do not. So those test data were done with a higher privacy parameter, so that protected the data more than we will in the final data. And also we've worked out many of the sort of other processing issues that cause some discrepancies. And so we'll be releasing additional data in April that folks can look at. That'll be a lot closer to, but even probably still not quite as accurate as the final data that we put out. So,
do you believe the final data will be accurate as to these small towns, despite the use of this differential privacy?
So accuracy and privacy are conflicting goals, and we are trying our best to balance the accuracy with protecting the respondent information. So.
Got to be sure the data is usable, one, and be sure that it can be upheld in a court because it's going to be likely subject to litigation. Well, thank you. I'm informed that Senator Rosen is actually next. I'm sure, Senator Romney, you're right up there, but I'd like now to turn to Senator Rosen virtually.
Thank you, Senator Portman. I appreciate it, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Of course, this topic is extremely important to all of us across the country for so many reasons, and I appreciate your hard work and efforts always, but of course, during the pandemic, it made everything so much more challenging. But honestly, during the 2020 census, Nevada saw the highest self-response growth rate of any state in the country. That's due in large part to our state's outreach strategies, the critical partnerships that we've developed with the Census Bureau, our state and local elected officials, and of course, all of our community leaders. So we've created inroads across the state from diverse communities to urban areas, including our hard to reach communities, our tribal communities. And we really were laser focused on diversity and inclusion to ensure that every Nevadan was counted by meeting people where they were. So as we look ahead at the next 10 years, greater emphasis on increased diversity of the census workforce, I believe, can create and really improve census accuracy and reach more people. So Dr. Jarmon, understanding the pandemic added an extra challenge for the census workforce for our recruitment, for our retention. How would you assess the Bureau's effort to recruit a diverse workforce during the last census, and what can we do to improve that in each and every one of our communities. That's going to be key to a good count.
So that certainly was a focus, Senator. I've not yet seen the data from the demographic breakdown of the folks that we hired to see if we did better than in 2020. I will say though that it was a challenge to get folks on board during the pandemic. Even with the economy hurting as it was, I think there was a lot of resistance of folks going out on the street and putting on a mask and knocking on doors. But obviously, we want to recruit a workforce for the census that looks like the communities that they're engaged in. We do that because it's important, because that's what builds trust with folks whose doors we're knocking on, and so that will continue to be a focus of the 2030 census.
I look forward to seeing that report when you have that. But speaking of diversity, another reason that this is so incredibly important is because we have to break down our language barriers and, of course, our technology barriers. So two key barriers, we know this, they're the barriers to census participation. You have been, I know, working on language access and technological hurdles. To truly account every American, we have to ensure that the census materials are available in the languages diverse communities speak in their home. And so I applaud the Bureau for providing resources and materials in 59 non-English languages. Currently, the questionnaire itself is only in 12 non-English languages, excluding a large number of South and Southeast Asian languages spoken by the AAPI communities in Nevada and across the country. Another huge concern that my office had for my constituents throughout the year, for us, and particularly in our underserved and our rural communities, was lack of access to broadband and the technological literacy among our senior citizens and underserved populations, and they couldn't actually do the census. And so between that, the fears of postal delays, slowdowns at USPS, we had our work cut out for us. So what do you think, Dr. Jarmon, the Census Bureau can do in the future to break down language barriers and ensure that more people have access through technology, maybe through an app on the phone, something? Everyone has a phone. They may not have an iPad or computer, but a lot of people have phone and phone service. How do we do that?
So that's a good question, Senator. So, you could respond to the 2020 census on your phone this time. The key issue with folks that have lack of access, and we mapped the country. We tended to know where those areas were, and we focused those areas for other collection activities. That's probably a lot of rural areas where we do update leave, where they don't have city-style addresses, where we actually send somebody out to leave a paper form that has the instructions to fill it out online, also on the form. So I think there's a number of ways that we address that, and we'll continue to sort of refine those over the next decade. But obviously, broadband access is probably only going to increase, and so we hope to be able to build on that and to have more of the country sort of in sort of the primary collection mechanism and have to rely on these other methods less. But that's something that we're going to have to track over the decade to make sure that, whatever the technology is, whatever the service level that the Postal Service can provide, that we're ready to be able to utilize those resources in the best possible way to help us get the census done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. In my remaining time, I want to ask a question to Mr. Marinos, and something near and dear to my heart, IT modernization. You appeared recently at a hearing at the GAO on the GAO high risk report, where we discussed the need to modernize IT systems and, of course, our cybersecurity in the federal government. And I appreciate you following up with my office on the topic. But how does the experience of the 2020 census taking place in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic illustrate the need for federal agencies to modernize their IT infrastructure? We have 10 years till we do this again. I don't want to see us on the same programs 10 years from now.
Senator Rosen, I think we saw successes in the internet self-response system operating without any downtime, and actually greater expectations than what Census had set. So I think about a 9% higher level of responses before census enumerators were out knocking on doors. So that's a positive. But to get there, it took a lot of effort. It took a lot of integration across 52 systems that the Bureau had set forward to manage all of the operations that it had in place, continuing to do so during the conclusions of the 2020 census. We also saw towards the later part of this past decade an increase in the IT spending by the Bureau. It had increased its estimate by $1.5 billion, in large part because of the need for technical integration between systems. So where that leaves us, it leaves us with 9.5 years of opportunity to try to set forward a plan that's going to help to build off of the things that worked well, like the internet self-response, and also start to think about what could be done to streamline the process moving forward for 2030.
Well, I look forward to working on that. I think there's things that can be standard amongst all 50 states and territories, and then allow for some things on the back end that we may have to do different in our states. I appreciate that conversation. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Carper.
Thank you. Thank you. This question, if I could lead off with Dr. Jarmon, and I understand that the Census Bureau made several late operational and design changes for the 2020 decennial census in response to both COVID and to decisions made by the Department of Commerce. I think it was in December of 2020 that the GAO reported that the Bureau planned to assess these changes and agreed with GAO's recommendations that this assessment should address data quality concerns relating to data from non-response follow-up in group quarters enumeration efforts. Could you take a moment to discuss the Bureau's response to date in conducting this assessment? And further, can you tell us how will this assessment help the Bureau as it begins planning for the 2030 count?
So thank you, Senator Carper. So, we are in the midst of that assessment. Obviously, we're still trying to get the data out the door, and that's taking most of our priority right now. But I think one interesting point on this that we've already had some conversations about thinking of leading towards 2030 is exactly on the issue of group quarters. I think what the pandemic exposed was the way that our household surveys, not just the census, but the American Community Survey and other household censuses, treat people living in a group quarter situation is maybe overly complex and doesn't lead to an efficient operation, especially when something changes like with the pandemic. So we have another side of the Census Bureau, the business side, where these same group quarters are actually businesses in many cases, and that they are very efficient at keeping track of these institutions and staying in contact with them. And so one of the things I think that we're going to be looking at over the next few years is how to integrate those two things and get both sides of the Census Bureau working together on these group quarters in a way that probably yields better information for both. That's sort of the win-win here. But I think there are definitely some lessons learned here that I think that the pandemic exposed. That if it wasn't for the pandemic, these operations probably would have gone along and worked as planned. But I think that there are some things that we can do that we recognize were problems all along, but the pandemic really sort of exposed them. So, thank you.
Yeah, speaking of group quarters, I can think of some examples in the state of Delaware. We have we raise a lot of chickens in the state of Delaware. I think for every person who lives in Delaware, there are maybe 300 or 400 chickens. That's a lot of chickens per person. And some of the folks who work in our poultry processing plants are from Central America and other places in south of our country. And they live not always, but not infrequently in group quarters. We have universities. We have several universities in our state land grant colleges, and it's not uncommon for students to live in group quarters. And there are other examples of that as well. It used to be the Dover Air Force Base was probably an example, and we've done a whole lot to provide better quarters for our enlisted personnel and officers. So that's maybe less the situation. Thank you. One second question, if I could, for Mr. Mim. Mr. Mim, are you ready to answer a question that I might ask?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. This deals with avoiding political interference in future decennial planning and operations. The last administration, as we'll recall, repeatedly tried to undermine the census through political interference, whether it was the attempted addition of a question on citizenship or in order to exclude undocumented immigrants from the 2020 census. The independence of the Census Bureau was under strain in 2020 too often. Some have proposed that Congress consider separating the census from the heart of the campaign cycle by allowing the Bureau to begin data collection early and by giving the Census Director enhanced legal authority and support to ensure independence from inappropriate interference. Mr. Mim, could you share some options we in Congress may want to consider to ensure that the independence and the integrity of the Census Bureau and the decennial count, please?
Yes, sir. And thank you, Senator Carper, for the question. Is that just to first address the basic premise of the question about the importance of political independence of the professional staff at the Census Bureau, that's something on behalf of the Congress that we were very alert to and concerned to throughout this census cycle. I can tell you that all the evidence that we saw was that the professional staff at the Census Bureau, Dr. Jarmon and his colleagues, were in the driver's seat of the fundamental operational decisions that were being made. Obviously, there was some larger executive branch Department of Commerce decisions, as you've alluded to, that were made above the Census Bureau. But we had unfettered access to Dr. Jarmon, to the head of the field operations, and in fact, just unprecedented access to them and transparency into how the census operated. I think one thing to consider is that there were a number of political appointees that were brought in relatively late in the census cycle. By all evidence that we've been able to gather is that they did not have undue influence into the operations of the census, but putting either limitations on those or rather, just making sure that there be greater clarity on exactly what their roles of responsibilities for any political leadership would be other than the Census Bureau director, could certainly help in maintaining the confidence in the integrity and the independence of the census.
Good, thanks so much. One last quick question for you and Mr. Marinos. Could you each take a moment to share some lessons learned from the 2020 census, and what are some of the areas where clearly we could do more, we should do more of the same, and others where we need to maybe go back to the drawing board? Thank you.
Sure, I'll start, Senator Carper. I mentioned earlier in response to Senator Rosen's question the importance of thinking ahead when it comes to system implementation. We saw a lot of the increase in cost go to the integration of the dozens of systems that the Bureau had to put in place in order for operations to operate as intended. So that's one area. The second area is ensuring that they have the appropriate staff on site to be able to manage the contracted support that they're receiving. A lot of that, again, funding went to the integration, which was done in part by private companies, by vendors. And so it's important to have the appropriate expertise in-house. And what we found consistently is within the key contractor oversight office that they were often running rather thin, at times even only at half capacity in terms of the number of staff that were there to support it. And finally, the importance of schedule. There are very few operations within the federal government that have a date that's set within the Constitution. That is a very rare thing when it comes to an IT major modernization effort. And so it makes the importance of schedule even greater. Cost, schedule, two things that the Bureau can think about early in this decade, leveraging the successes like the internet self-response to think about how it could tackle 2030 early and to get ahead of the curve.
My thanks to both of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator Carper. The chair recognizes Senator Padilla for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their tremendous work and testimony so far in today's hearing. I wanted to touch on a couple of areas that I don't think have been touched on already. First question is for Mr. Mim. In the GAO report titled Census Bureau Needs to Assess Data Quality Concerns Stemming from the Recent Design Changes that was published in December of 2020, it was mentioned that to save costs, the Bureau increased its reliance on solely using administrative records to count non-responsive households. One of the examples constantly pointed to is including Medicare enrollment data, as well as individual tax return data to improve the count. The report highlights some issues regarding the use of tax data. For example, individuals not having enough income to have to file tax returns or not listing dependents for tax purposes. However, I'm also concerned with the reliance of other public benefits data. Soon after taking office, former President Trump announced that he would be expanding the definition of public charge, which meant that whether an immigrant uses public benefits such as housing assistance, SNAP, Medicaid, that it could be considered a negative factor in a green card application. So as a result of the public charge rule change, many immigrants disenrolled from benefits that they were eligible for or did not enroll in benefits for which their U.S. citizen children were eligible. So, Mr. Mim, can you take a minute just to discuss how the public charge rule and using administrative data to count non-responsive households might lead to inaccuracies?
Yes, thank you, Senator. We haven't looked specifically at the public charge issue, but the larger thesis behind your question is exactly right, and that is that to the extent that residents are not captured in administrative data, I mean, the truism is, therefore, that administrative record would not be useful for helping to enumerate their household. And in fact, what we also know is that the administrative records are most valuable for some of these hard to count populations, some of the last few percentage of the population that either didn't respond on their own or didn't respond to a census taker when they went and knocked on the door. That's why some of the records that they use are exactly what you were saying: the SNAP, the WIC, the Medicaid records. So again, to the extent that someone's not in the system, the records will not be useful in terms of enumerating them, and you therefore increase the risk that they will be missed.
Okay. Thank you. More to follow up on that, but for another topic that I believe is timely, this is for Dr. Jarmon. A program called the Count Question Resolution gives state, local, and tribal governments an opportunity to challenge their census results and seek revised counts for purposes other than redistricting and other than apportionment. However, those challenges must be based on a very limited set of criteria involving geographic or processing mistakes affecting living quarters. And I think we've already discussed in this hearing the dynamic of living quarters, housing units, group facilities, et cetera. So in light of the many challenges to conducting a complete and accurate census last year, will the Census Bureau consider expanding the scope of the Count Question Resolution Program to allow challenges based on a broader set of outcomes that indicate significant miscounts or undercounts in a jurisdiction?
So, Senator, I'm not familiar with any discussions to broaden those definitions, but we would certainly be willing to take a look at that and get the folks on my team that are responsible for that and talking to you or your staff or to whomever. But I at this time, I'm not aware of any of those discussions right now.
Okay. Well, then consider this a request for consideration, and we'll have through our staffs follow up to see how that can be explored. The next decennial census is only 9 years away, so we're already starting to work on that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Senator Hessen, you are recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman, and thank you to our witnesses for not only your testimony today, but for your service. To Mr. Marinos, I want to start with a question to you. The 2020 census was the first to feature an online response option. More than half of census respondents in New Hampshire and across the country use the online platform to be counted, and I commend the Census Bureau for its successful rollout of the online response platform and the broader IT infrastructure, which experienced no security breaches that we're aware of, nor any significant outages during the data collection period. So you've heard questions around these issues from Senators Rosen and Carper, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to add on to your previous answers. What steps did the Census Bureau take when setting up its IT infrastructure to ensure its security and functionality?
Senator Hassan, I think the importance of starting early in this decade can't be overemphasized. There were many changes to the decisions that were being made by the Bureau around the mid part of this past decade, in particular taking, for example, the Internet self-response. One of the key systems supporting that effort was an in-house developed system. Later on in the decade, the Bureau determined that it made more sense to pursue a vendor-provided solution, and so it put effort into that area. We saw right before implementation of the Internet self-response a flip from the contractor-provided software to the original planned effort. What that means is cost and increases and additional constraints to schedules, because there are going to be opportunities for risk to be injected when there are late design changes. And so I think that it's extremely important for the Bureau to reflect on the successes of the Internet self-response system in terms of its implementation, in terms of its functionality, but to step back and think for the upcoming decade, how can it do it in a more cost-effective and more schedule-conscious way?
So let me follow up on that for a minute, because the other piece of this is you all have now had this experience. What can other agencies learn from the Census Bureau's successful efforts to prepare and execute the 2020 census on a digital platform? Just any lessons learned you would share across government?
Yeah, I would say, actually, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the trust and safety team that the Bureau put in place was an innovative one. It was an important one because obviously the census being one of the key government operations taking place just last year, it took a lot of lessons learned from its experiences in combating disinformation and misinformation. And now, and I can defer to Dr. Jarmon if you'd like to add more details to this, but is now actually using that information to provide assistance to organizations like CDC to think about how it can combat the potential for disinformation and misinformation during this pandemic as well. So I think we can commend the Bureau for not only taking the fight to online to really ensure that the facts are straight, but to try to use those experiences to help in other parts of government as well.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to turn to Dr. Jarmon now. And Dr. Jarmon, if you want to follow up on that, I'm going to ask a question first, and you might want to combine responses. Last week, this committee held a hearing on the SolarWinds cyber campaign that compromised federal, state, and private data. As incidents like the SolarWinds campaign become more sophisticated and more difficult to apprehend, we have to take steps to proactively protect data, including the use of continuous diagnostics and mitigation programs at all civilian agencies. As it continues to organize and eventually disseminate the data collected from the 2020 census, how is the Census Bureau working to secure this valuable data against malicious activities?
So thank you, Senator. So that's a great question. So we actually were one of the organizations using SolarWinds, and we've done a thorough review and have determined that our instance of it is safe. But we are on this all the time. We started developing a good working relationship a few years before the 2020 census with CISA at DHS, and we're going to continue to do that throughout the decade. That's now going to be a permanent a feature of our stance. I'll add that the Census Bureau has many valuable data assets in addition to the data we collect from the 2020 census. We have a host of other survey data that we collect, administrative records that we get from other government agencies and from the states, and looking to get access to even newer and more innovative data to produce better statistics for the American public. So keeping that information secure is one of our top priorities, and I think as we move forward in the decade, we're going to be looking at various architectural innovations to really keep our data in a secure but accessible to those who need it type of infrastructure, so that we can ensure the public that the data are safe. I like to glibly say that the census is the data roach hotel. Secure data come in, but only safe outputs go out. And so that is a commitment that we strongly believe in. And we can't do our jobs without ensuring that the data that we have access to and process is kept secure.
Well, thank you for that. I want to very quickly ask Mr. Marinos if you think that the Census Bureau is taking all the necessary and appropriate steps to protect the information collected by the 2020 census. And if you can be fairly brief, I have one more question to ask.
Sure. We've been encouraged with the approach that the Bureau's been taking. We still have some outstanding recommendations that we've made regarding how it actually remediates some of the weaknesses that the Bureau identifies, but we're going to continue to follow up on that.
Okay, thank you. Last question for Dr. Jarmon again. The Census Bureau's transition to digital data gathering and the end-to-end operations of the 2020 census is estimated to cost $15.6 billion, making it the most expensive decennial census ever conducted. The Bureau has passed deadlines for disseminating critical count information, and we've been talking about the relating delays that could in fact increase expenditures. Does the Census Bureau anticipate any cost overruns as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted data collection and has delayed disseminating the apportionment data?
As Senator, we do not. I think we're going to come in well under the $15.6 billion, and that even includes the billion in contingency expenditures that we had to introduce because of COVID. So I think when it all comes out in the wash, will show that we actually did sort of bend the needle a little bit on costs with the 2020 census, and I think that'll be a good outcome that we can talk about.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'll follow up with Dr. Mim to see if you all agree with that assessment. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Dr. Jarmon, I'd like an update from you on the non-response follow-up survey, which I understand has resumed in the field after its work in the fall. Are you aware of any issues that might present the possibility of an undercount, particularly in rural or underserved communities hit particularly hard by COVID-19? And can you give us an update on the NRFU process this spring, please?
So the non-response follow-up operation is done. It ended in mid-October. With the field operation relative to the decennial census that we're undergoing right now is the post-enumeration survey. And I just got an update the other day. Our response rates are well over 90%. And that is the survey that we use to measure the coverage of the survey. And that's how we know the degree to which some households were undercounted and some households were overcounted. And so that work continues, and we'll be done with field collection with that shortly, and then begin to start processing that data so that we can then assess the accuracy of the 2020 census.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmon. And can you explain, for the benefit of the committee as well as state officials who may be watching and anticipating the data they'll be receiving, how states might use the legacy format summary redistricting data files that would be sent in addition to the raw data to support states' redistricting processes, and what concerns for a fair redistricting process might result from the presentation of the data using the legacy format?
So thanks, Senator. So the legacy format is much like what we produced in 2010. So many states will probably be familiar with it. I know that there's vendors out there that have used the data in this format that have assisted the states in the past. The final format, the data that will be released in September, actually has more functionality. It'll come with built-in software that allows folks to really drill down into the data in a much easier, user-friendly way. So the data that will be released in August will be much like what was released in 2010. So folks that were familiar with that should find it familiar. But still, the data we're releasing in September is what we've worked with them over this decade to make improvements, and so that won't be available till September.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmon. And am I correct that the Household Pulse survey is still ongoing online?
You're correct. It is ongoing.
one of the concerns is that communities that are on the wrong side of the digital divide, particularly during COVID-19, where there's been displacement, that communities without access to broadband internet, without access to computer hardware, may have their needs, their voices underrepresented in a household pulse survey that's conducted principally online. I want to commend the Census Bureau for using technology in this way to get what is vital data, but ask what efforts you're making to ensure that there's not underrepresentation of low-income, technologically disadvantaged communities when you're gathering the data in this way.
So thanks, Sarah. So like lots of our surveys, even if we were using more traditional mail-based method, we often have survey non-response, and so we use statistical methods to weight the data so that it's representative of the population as a whole, and we're doing that with the household pulse survey. But one of the considerations we had with the household pulse survey was, we favored getting the data out in a very timely fashion, and I think that's what drove the decision, to go with a completely online type response option. We did the same thing with the small business pulse survey. These are both using, sort of innovative contact strategies, either text messaging or emails, and trying to get information really quickly. And so, I think it's a trade-off between how much you try to make sure that you get the survey in front of various folks versus how quickly you can get the data out. And I think with the pulse surveys, we really, tried to push things towards getting the data out quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Jarmon. Appreciate that. And again, do appreciate that you're using technology in innovative ways to gather data more efficiently and more swiftly. And would you be able to share with the committee, if it's not already in the publicly available methodology, the process that you use to arrive at the weighting of that data, what the underlying statistical basis for it is, and the effect that it has taking the raw data and after weighting such data, converting it into the published data? Could you provide the committee, if it's not already public, with that information, please?
If it doesn't already exist, we'll get that put together and make it available, not just to the committee but to the public.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each of you for being here today. Certainly your testimony is very important and an issue that we're going to continue to be focused on in the months ahead. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until April 7th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. And with that, this hearing is now adjourned.